Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. One of the great delights in interviewing authors is to get in on the ground floor with an author whose debut novel not only delivers the goods, but promises many more of equal satisfaction to come. Our guest today is one of those delights. Wesley Moore served his time in the trenches as a teacher for 34 years at a Charleston, South Carolina school. And after teaching the next generation of writers, he decided to join them. After his retirement, his debut novel, Today, Oh Boy, was published. It's a fascinating study of a day in the life of high school students in a small South Carolina town in October of 1970. It is told with wit and is, as one reviewer called it, remarkable nuanced. We're very pleased to welcome Wesley Moore.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure being here.
Were you always going to be a teacher?
No, in fact, I hated high school, and the idea of spending the rest of my life in high school would have seemed like a prison sentence in 1971 when I graduated. But I really didn't major in anything in college. I just took classes, and once I got to be a junior, they told me I had to be an English major. And I didn't take any education courses. So when I ultimately graduated, I really wasn't equipped to do anything except teach.
Oh, and somehow that found you. And were you taught any other place before you landed where you did?
Yeah, I taught at a place called Trident Technical College at community college in the Charleston area, and I actually fell in love with teaching. And I absolutely love teaching almost every moment of it. So it worked out well for me.
Okay. When when you retired, was there an incident or a series of circumstances that stirred you to do your own writing for a change?
Well, I actually started writing before I started teaching. I
Oh,
was publishing short fiction in the early 1980s, and my late wife, Judy Birdsong, we had a baby, and she wanted to stay home with him. And so I had to find a job other than writing because I couldn't support the family. And
mhm.
so I ended up, luckily, getting a job at Porter School, which is a superb um, school.
You know, writers are divided into two categories, the pantsers and the plotters, those who write with the seat of their pants, and those who outline everything in advance. I suspect as many characters as you're working with, you're the latter.
Yeah, well, I'm the seat of the pants guy.
Oh, really? How
Yeah.
fascinating.
But what helped me organize the novel is that the first four chapters go by the periods of the school day. So
Hmm.
it's very chronologically linear. And that helped me keep things going. And then there's an accident. As you know, a chemistry lab goes wrong and they have to release all the students of the school. And then it became a little bit more freewheeling. But it's interesting. I sent the novel before I published it, the two fiction editors, to look at it, and one of them complained that it didn't have a an outline, but I think it worked out beautifully. All the loose ends are tied up, and the reviews have actually lauded the plotting, so I'm satisfied.
Well, and so should we as readers be. I get the feel as I'm reading it too. Also, there's a strong indication. I can see this with a very little translation, meaning a movie script. Is that intentional, or is that more a result of we're all used to more fast cuts and interesting juxtapositions these days?
It was in the forefront of my mind. I learned a lot from Ernest Hemingway's short fiction, and he's very cinematic. There's a scene, for example, well, this isn't a short story, the novel The Sun Also Rises, in which he leads your eyes up to see an explosion of fireworks, and when your eyes come down, the plaza is filled with people. So I try to make my writing very cinematic so that the reader can visualize things.
Well, as an old DJ, I'm always sensitive to music in books, and yours is chock full of good stuff. Um, I have to say that some of them are artists that well, whose appeal has not faded over the years. And we're talking Beatles and the Stones and Bob Dylan. But I love the fact that you go deep into the area with such things as Van Morrison's GLORIA or some of the other ones that you mentioned. Oh, and I absolutely love the fact that you alluded to. Bill Graham's introduction to Big Brother and the Holding Company's combination of the two on a Cheap Thrills album as Four Gentlemen and One Great Broad. And that just set me right back there. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for reading and thank you for noticing it. I love that song.
Yeah.
Um,
The interesting thing I thought about, I mean, I did catalog all the songs that were in there, and for a novel set in South Carolina, I surprisingly only two country songs are mentioned. One of them, Skeeter Davis, which was a big crossover in the pop side, and the other one, George Jones. It was a good year for the Roses. So I'm wondering if we always more the pop or rock side than the country fan.
oh, I came to country music late. I started off with rock and roll and discovered the blues, oddly
Mhm.
enough, through the Rolling Stones and Eric Burden and the Animals. And then I became a big blues aficionado and really didn't start listening to country music until the mid 70s with the Outlaws, Waylon Jennings and
Mhm.
Willie Nelson.
Okay, interesting. As a blues person, I'm glad to see that you didn't go for something obvious. You went to Paul Butterfield, who is somewhat deep in the pack, so an excellent player. So thank you for that one as well. Uh, in fact, there's so many cultural references in here. I mean, I've got huge catalogs of all of the things you mentioned. There are movies, there are authors and books, there are television shows, and you run the gamut, I think. And I'm wondering if that's kind of on purpose to talk to the people like myself of a certain age, but also for the younger generation as well.
Yeah, it since it takes place in 1970, boomers are really going to like this novel. It
Oh,
reminds them of their own past, but students are really interested in the 60s and 70s themselves, and this gives them a little glance into it. And on the other hand, the high school experience is more or less universal.
hmm
They're going to high school in the 1950s. They're going to be jocks. They're going to be in the 50s beatniks. Uh,
hmm
they'll be preppies, and so I um I wanted to tap into the 70s, into the Cultural Revolution also because the town of Somerville, where the novel is set, had a population then of 3,500 people. Now it has 57,000 people
Oh.
living. And so the town itself, like the students, is undergoing the beginnings of adolescence, a big change.
One of the things you have is a lot of characters in this. And I have the feeling, as I was reading it, that all these characters had backstories, that you had in your mind what they were, and you conveyed little bits of it just enough to tease us.
I think characters are the most important aspect of fiction. And you need to care about the characters and they need to seem as if they're real people. So when I create a character, I think about the character before the action of the novel starts, and I think about the character after the action of the novel ends. For example, the teacher, Mrs. Laban, who seems like she's a heavy, but she's actually a really good teacher, a really caring teacher. We're seeing her through Rusty's perspective, through the student's perspective, but one of the students, Camilla Creel, really likes Mrs. Laban. And Mrs. Laban grew up a Baptist in South Carolina. And I actually even pictured her as a little girl sitting on a pew in a church. So I try to give my characters life, and I also try to make them all a little bit sympathetic. Even Bobby Beauchene, who's sadistic in a sense, he grew up poor and with a violent father, so there's an excuse for his personality.
Yeah. I think another thing that you do, maybe in regards to that, is what I used to call the telling detail. And for instance, here's one sentence. James Hopper, the best dressed boy on campus, divorced parents, James' father, who he rarely sees, sells real estate in Charlotte, and has a wedded bimbo named Patsy, who James detests. There's a setup right there in one sentence, and you've got some depth to the person. I really appreciate that. And somehow I feel like this is a framework where you could go back and tell backstories of all these other characters. Is that
Yeah,
something you're planning on doing?
not really, but That's true. I could, I write stories about all the characters. Jill Birdsong, Ollie, and some of the even minor characters. Like my wife Caroline wanted me to write more about Corilla Creel, the impoverished girl who lives in a school bus. And that's actually based on a girl who lived in Orangeburg County, a friend of mine back in the days when high school students drove school buses, picked up a girl in his school bus who lived in a school bus.
Mm, interesting. Well, I also noticed that you go by a nickname Rusty, and there is a character nicknamed Rusty in there as well. I'm wondering if he's your eyes in the scene.
Yeah, well, I tell people that they all say, "Oh, the Rusty's you," but he's really not me. One thing, he's a lot nicer than I was in high school, and he's a terrible writer. There's a little snippet of that essay
Oh
that,
Lord, yes. Yeah.
that so, but he and Ollie are I call them co-protagonists. They're foils. They're different from one another, but they share some commonalities.
Yeah, and there you've got all sorts of people. You've got people who are homegrown. You've got people who have moved from elsewhere, which gives you an interesting uh, offset from time to time with different viewpoints. And that must have been fun generating all these characters.
It really was. I mean, you're playing God in a sense, and
Mhm.
you create these characters, you give them personalities, and what I do is I let them be themselves. I don't pre-think about what they're going to do or how they're going to behave, and sometimes they might surprise me. I know that sounds odd and perhaps even pretentious, but that's the way I operate.
You know, I've interviewed hundreds of authors, and a lot of them say that they start to write something, and then they say, no, the character would not do that. The character won't let me write that. I have to change it. And one of the toughest parts of being an author is you have to kill your baby. Sometimes you get what you think is a perfect paragraph, but it doesn't advance the story. You have to throw it away.
Well, I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is true or not, that Thomas Hardy wept for 2 days after he killed Tess, Tess
Gee,
of the Mills, and he loved her so much, and he had to kill her. The story wouldn't have worked otherwise.
yeah, yeah, and depending on what kind of story you're telling, you do have to do that. Absolutely. Getting inside the minds of some of these people, I'm thinking of Bobby Beauchene mostly, who have a tough time dealing with things and are angry all the time. Was that hard to do?
Oh, well, I grew up, in Somerville's a economically diverse, the diverse town. And we had, when people started growing their hair long and embracing the counterculture, some of these people like Bobby Beauchene became violent. There was a friend of mine who actually had his hair forcibly cut when he was jumped. They cut it off. They didn't scalp him, but they held him down and cut his hair off. So the violence was not, it didn't happen all the time, but it was possible.
Mhm. You do touch gently a bit on race relations in here because there's some mention of it and a little conflict here and there. That's kind of a delicate subject always.
Yeah, well, the my high school didn't become fully integrated until my senior year, which is the year after this takes place. And before then, the students, black students, were sort of handpicked. And my analogy is Jackie Robinson, the great
Mm.
Dodgers player. Students who were motivated, who were middle class and had thick skins. And there's one, the Manago boy in the story. We see how sort of subtly racism works. When the school is let out because of the chemistry experiment early, he's going to the parking lot to drive his car home. And Mrs. Latham assumes because he's black, he wouldn't have a car. And she fusses at him and says, "You need to get back to the cafeteria for the buses." He says, "No, ma'am, I own a car."
Yeah, that's a perfect example of the assumptions people make in
Right.
that. And that's what usually kills us are the assumptions that we make that aren't true. So, yeah. What do you hope that people take away from this when they put the book down?
Well, first of all, I hope they're entertained. And secondly, I hope they care about the characters and that it would, in a way, create some compassion for different viewpoints. I channel the omniscient narrator through several minds and several perspectives. And so people see the world in very different ways. And it's a shame that things become so fragmented that we can't realize that we're actually all brothers and sisters and get along better.
Yeah, absolutely. I also find it interesting when you've got Alex and his dad, the lawyer, and kind of moving gently because obviously if you're a lawyer you could be a lot harder, but in that time and place he represents the viewpoint, I think, without antagonizing people. That's an interesting way to go.
Yeah, the Alex and his parents are rare liberals in conservative Somerville, South Carolina. And Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. 16 years later, the school hasn't been fully integrated yet. And yet Alex is being drawn to the office. His parents sent in because he actually had the temerity to bring a National Lampoon magazine to class. And so rather than being upset about they're not following the laws of the land, they're upset about this satiric magazine.
Right, right. There's a speech that one of them does in their head talking about this versus, well, if this person does that, they're in big trouble. This person does that, they're on the football team that's you get skipped. So, and that, as we all know, has happened before. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, indeed.
By the way, may I interject? You're a superb reader.
Ah,
Um, Very sensitive to detail and able to synthesize all this. So congratulations on that. I appreciate it.
oh, thank you. I've been doing you're author number 840 something in my list. I'm going for 1,000. That's my goal. Then I'll write a book about all you. So this will be fun. You also put in some relevant, timely things to help put us in not just the social media, but the things that were happening at the time. You talked about Pierre Trudeau having problems with the Quebecois and whatnot, but you don't overdo that. It's just enough little sprinkling and finding that depth to do that. Is that just something that comes naturally? Do you have to work at that?
Oh, well, I had to look that up. I wanted to find some obscure controversy that was going on at the time. So that wasn't at the forefront. I did that little bit of research to do that.
Mhm.
But I really just try to create similitude. I want people to suspend their disbelief, to use Coleridge's term, and
Mhm.
to forget they're sitting on a sofa or sitting in a hammock. I want them to enter the world. And the more details like that you can subtly introduce, the more likely it is that they'll get into the book.
I also there's so many themes in this thing that we could talk all day about it. But one of the things that I love is several of the characters are planning to and have built a raft to float down the river to catch a train or something to get to Canada, basically because of the draft. That was a very big deal at the time. And I'm just, we're all getting this kind of, when they're teaching this in sophomore English, they'll say, oh yeah, that's a Huckleberry Finn and on the road kind of things about that. That was so much fun. I really wanted to mark that because I appreciated it so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Rusty's a bookworm and he's a romantic, and he has a really hard time distinguishing between fiction and real life. And so it's this harebrained scheme that they build the raft and they have help, and they're going to float down the Ashley River and dut the raft and then go hop a freight train like on the road. Not that they had
Yeah.
freight road, but it's a nice little backstory, I think.
Well, it is, it is. And I'm also a big fan of books that take a lot of characters, get them introduced, and then a big event at the end shows them all reacting to each other. And of course, without giving it away, I will say that there is such a thing, and it's pretty fun. I'll have to say it. The what has been a very measured, interesting, involved suddenly gets really fast in the action, and then winds up with a very satisfying conclusion, I think.
Well, thank you very much. It was the Kirkus Review says a dazzling characters front this quietly sublime period piece, and I love that review. I think it's great, but I don't think it's all that quiet.
But it,
It's not going on at the end.
I think maybe what the word I would use would be subtle. There's a lot of very subtle things in this book, and a lot. We used to call them Easter eggs when you're looking when you're doing gameplay, and they find some little something that's out of the game, and just kind of for the aficionados in the group. There's tons of that in your book. You've got so many little bits and pieces. That I went, oh, cool, gotta note that. Gotta note that. Yeah. And I just have the vision of you sitting there at the keyboard, giggling, well, laughing, not giggling, you wouldn't giggle, but chortling maybe at some of the things you write.
Yeah, well, I'll actually a couple of times laugh out loud even when I'm rereading it now.
Mhm.
That it was incredible, a lot of fun, and it came to me very easily. The analogy I used, it was like I was floating down the river on a raft. I would write for about an hour. When I knew what was going to happen next, I'd put it down and then I'd take it back up, and that went all the way to the end.
Oh, fantastic. How long did it take you to write this?
Maybe 8 to 10 months.
That's pretty good for a novel of this complexity, particularly. Yeah.
I
When
was
I say
teaching.
when I
I'm
say
sorry,
complete, sorry.
my fault. I stepped over you. I was teaching at the time, which the reason I quit writing is I couldn't teach and write at the same time.
Oh yeah. This people don't realize just how much prep time is needed by teachers that you don't see. They think, oh well, they only work a few hours a day and they have the whole summer off. No, no, no. It's they have stuff they have to do to keep educated and keep their license, and they have huge hours of prep time if they're going to be a good teacher outside. So let's vote for preacher salaries going up. All right. This,
Yeah, well, we can all agree on that.
um, do you have something else in the works at this moment? Because we know that, it takes a year and a half, 2 years to get something, even from the time you turn it in, to get it out the door. And I'm assuming you're working on book two and maybe book three at this point.
Well, for the last 15 years or so, or 10 years at least, I've been publishing a blog
Ah,
and doing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. And so I've compiled a sort of mosaic memoir of my life called Long Ago Last Summer. Each piece can stand alone by itself, but if you were to read it from the start to the end, you would get sort of a mosaic picture of growing up in South Carolina from the early 1950s through today. And it begins with a long short story. There's another short story. Then there's a nonfiction piece, poetry. So I'm very excited about it. My publisher gets first refusal rights, so I'm fairly certain it'll be published.
fantastic. We'll be looking forward to that. Um, there's one thing that many writers have told me. It says you can't not write. That if you have an idea, you have this compulsion to sit down and get it down on paper, as it were.
Yeah, I have that compulsion. I need to write, and also when I was teaching, I thought that writing the blog helped me be sympathetic with the students and their writing and to stay fresh and to realize there are certain things you have to teach in writing. For example, you have to teach students the rules of grammar, and then when you need to break the rules of
Mhm.
grammar. You want people to sound like people when they're writing, not like pundits.
Yeah. Oh, I know. One of the things that as a news person, I record a lot of meetings and whatnot, and people do not speak in these beautifully parsed sentences. it goes, yeah, and and all that stuff as well. So yeah, as real writings go. Um, this is so much fun that I just keep going back to bits after bits that just intrigue the heck out of me. Um, one of the ones that intrigues me is your picture of two different kinds of people involved in the police force in town. You have you have the not quite a caricature, good old boy, donut eating, can't hardly get his stomach behind the steering wheel boy who is more than a little prejudiced, and you've got a chief who has got some real depth to him. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, Chief Bigelow, I gave him an Irish name in honor of
Uh,
the the tradition of Irishmen being police officer.
mhm.
But he's a World War II veteran. He's seen a lot of the world. He's sort of a melancholy person, but he cares about people, and and he cares about the boys at the end.
Well, he deals with them not from hatred, as does one of his deputies who has a tendency to do that if you're not one of his people. Uh, but he does has a very caring side. It's a very touching moments, and toward the end there, uh, that surprised me, and I was very pleased to hear that.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
He says, one of the boys says, "You grow up fast down here," to Ollie, and he says, "No, you don't." He
That's
says,
it.
"In Vietnam, that's where you grow up fast."
Yeah, that's insights for you, and that's one thing a good author has to have is a good eye and a good ear for dialogue and an eye for the detail. And I think you've got them in spades, my friend. I'm very impressed with that.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate that. And especially hearing praise from an excellent reader makes all the difference in the world.
Well,
I,
happy to do so. I just call them as I see them. So there's no magic there. Um, if there anything that we have not touched on that you want to make sure we mention before we run out of time here?
I can't think of anything. I think you've done a superb job of covering the book, and I'm just happy it's doing well, and would love people to read it. Today, oh boy, oh, the title comes from the Beatles song "A Day in the Life." I heard the news today.
Yeah,
Oh,
oh boy, yes. And I recognize that immediately as an old disc jockey. I was going to mention that. Thank you for bringing that up because anything with a Beatles reference in the title, okay, this is one hip dude right away. So it's well worth reading.
but one last thing, man. Hold up the cover.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Okay, my friend David Boatwright did the cover,
All
and
right.
it has sort of a Hardy Boys on pot vibe to it, YA pulp, and he is. I'm so grateful for him because it's such a novel that draws people and it's not typical.
Super, super. Well, I just want to say that it has been a real delight talking with you today, and I wish you all the best. And do keep us in touch because when you do number two, I very much want to see that.
Oh, I would love that, and I really appreciate it, as I've said. Thank you.
Okay. Our guest today has been Wesley Moore. The book is Today, Oh Boy, and it is a gem. Thank you so much.